Well, welcome back to Office Hours. Now the office hours for the last years of Mao Zedong and the reopening of China. I'm here with Tiffany. Tiffany, thank you very much for joining me. She's an extraordinarily key member of our team, an editor extraordinaire and a researcher extraordinaire, making the videos that you see really as great as they are. So Tiffany, I want to take this occasion to thank you very much on my behalf, but on behalf of everyone who is watching, because if they had to watch only me or Bol, it would be incredibly boring. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
Now we have a few announcements to mention. Oh, first, let me just say Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy almost New Year. Now, some announcements.
Yes, so as requested by some learners, we have extended the deadline of Part 9. So you can finish the final assessments by 5 p.m. EDT on January 5th, if you would like to receive a certificate.
That's right. So you don't have to work too hard over Christmas and New Year's. Just take it easy. We're going to do that.
Yes, and you can take that time to catch up too if you wish.
Indeed, indeed.
Yes, and it would be really nice if you could take a couple minutes and fill out the final survey. You can choose to respond in either English or Chinese.
That's right. That survey is really helpful to us because we are looking for advice as to how to improve the next iteration. What do you like? What don't you like? And so on. If for some inexplicable reason you don't want to continue learning in Part 10, then there's an opt-out form on the screen that you can fill out. Otherwise, you'll be automatically enrolled in it. It begins January 8th. But I would encourage you to opt in, just stay in, as it were, because the best is yet to come. But meanwhile, we have some great responses from this last module and very interesting questions from the learners about Lin Biao, about Zhou Enlai, about the Gang of Four, and other protagonists of this period. So Tiffany, you want to give us some of the questions that we have?
Yes, so some learners want to know what happened to Lin Biao, what happened to the Gang of Four. Specifically, some learners found the discussion on Lin Biao somewhat confusing. They would like you to clarify a little more.
Well, I'll clarify as best I can, but you know, the fact is, this was almost deliberately confusing. The campaign against Lin Biao and Confucius was a highly arcane political struggle within the Chinese Communist Party between what we can think in retrospect as so-called moderates and so-called leftist radicals at the time, in which Lin Biao probably was less important, and what really happened to him less important than what they were really fighting over, which was the prospective succession to Mao Zedong. And they were couching it in ideological terms. My guess is that Lin Biao was dead by then. There's a plane carrying what were officially recognized as the remains of Lin Biao was found in Mongolia.
Right.
And so the great likelihood is that he's still dead. But beyond that, and anyone who really knows exactly what happened to Lin Biao and can prove it, that person should go to the top of our class, because it is shrouded in mystery, it is shrouded in political intrigue. Here we have a man who is a great general, a loyal supporter of Mao Zedong, who was faced with the prospect of being, apparently, purged by Mao, as Mao had purged all his prospective successors, and may or may not have taken action first, and may or may not have taken flight first. But almost everything we know about Lin Biao in this period and then from this incident comes from his enemies.
Right.
And that means we actually don't know very much. But again, anybody who really knows, this is your chance to make your mark as a historian and let us know what you think you know. It was an interesting one part of that same question.
Right.
Were any of the victims ever compensated? That's a remarkably charming idea. But the fact of the matter,
referring to the Cultural Revolution.
referring to the Cultural Revolution. Some people did, in fact, get property back. Some people were compensated more by what you might call rehabilitation of reputation.
Right.
A large number of people who had been branded as rightists or counter-revolutionaries
Or capitalists.
would have their their designation changed formally after 1978. That's probably about as much as compensation happened in this period. Now,
Right.
about the Gang of Four. What happened to the Gang of Four? Well, there was a trial. You're too young to remember the trial.
Right.
But I was teaching, really just beginning my teaching at Washington University in St. Louis. And as I was teaching a contemporary Chinese history class, a group of Americans came in and barged into the class, claiming that I was misrepresenting the teachings of Chairman Mao and of the Gang of Four. I actually hadn't said anything about it. We hadn't gotten that far in the class, but they assumed I was. And they were members of a leftist group in this country, close to a guy named Lyndon LaRouche, if I remember correctly. It was a very interesting kind of fringe movement on the left. But they were reading Zhang Chunqiao, Yao Wanyuan, the other members, the writings of the members of the Gang of Four, and they were claiming that they had been framed, and they were the true successors and revolutionaries, the true successors of Chairman Mao, and had been purged in a coup d'etat, at which they were not wrong, that it was a coup d'etat in 1976 against these leaders. At the same time, I discovered that you can buy the writings of Jiang Qing and of Zhang Chunqiao and other members of the Gang of Four, and you can even buy for your computer. It's an interesting thing. It has a picture of Chairman Mao, a mouse pad for your computer. And so a little bit of the Gang of Four exists still today in highly remnant form. The kids who came into my class knew nothing about China, but they believed fervently in Chairman Mao and in his revolution. But that trial, all of the members of the Gang of Four were put on trial. All of them were convicted.
Right.
All of them spent lengthy sentences in prison.
Right.
And one of them died in prison by her own hand, Jiang Qing.
Yes.
What do we really know about the Gang of Four? We know probably more about the Gang of Four's fate than about Lin Biao's, because there was at least a trial. The New York Times interviewed the lawyer for Jiang Qing, and they asked Jiang Qing's lawyer, "How often do you meet with your client?" And the lawyer responded, "I never meet with the criminal. What would be the point?" So they got a really fair trial. And in any event, off they went to prison, protesting all the way their innocence and their
Jiang
loyalty.
Qing protesting all the way.
Jiang Qing in particular protesting all the way. So what other questions do we have? These are
So,
good.
yes, a lot of people are very curious about Zhou Enlai and his role. If he was the savior of the current political system, as some seem to think he was. Did his exposure to foreign language and political awareness help him sort of navigate the political scene in China? Did Mao consider Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping his enemies? Was it because they were powerful in their own right? Was there any evidence that Zhou Enlai suffered in any way during the Cultural Revolution?
Zhou Enlai is a fascinating figure. He, apart from Mao Zedong, is the most important political figure over the history of the first 2.5 decades of the People's Republic. He is much more broadly educated, internationally educated than many of the other senior communist leaders. He's a very successful diplomat and a strongly influential international representative of the People's Republic, particularly in its first decade, the Bandung Conference, but also in the meetings with Nixon, where he took the lead in the rapprochement with the United States. At the same time, he is what you might call a whateverist. Whatever Chairman Mao wanted, he, at the end of the day, would do. He never backed any serious criticism of the excesses of Mao's rule, did not side, for example, with Peng Dehuai in 1959 at the Lushan Conference at the height of the Great Leap famine. He's a survivor by going with whatever wind Chairman Mao would go with. In principle, and allegedly moderating some of the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, but I think this is often overstated. He is, if one thinks of it in European political terms, the Talleyrand of China. He survives and can serve almost in any political moment. He does seem to have as much the interests of China at heart as of the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, and that does separate him from some other leaders at this period of time. Before the revolution, he had been involved in the underground gangster warfare of the Shanghai of the 1920s and the 1930s. This is a very tough man, a man who experienced civil war and would be willing to make great sacrifices of human life for political purposes as he saw fit. At the end of the day, however, he, perhaps as much as anyone else, helped to navigate China's re-engagement with the world in a manner that's probably not conceivable with Nguyen Biao, not conceivable with Mao Zedong by himself. Zhou Enlai had the confidence of individuals, his global interlocutors like Henry Kissinger, in a way that probably no other communist leader could have. So these are again excellent questions. We also asked you to think about this prose poem that Jiang Qing claimed was written to her by Chairman Mao before his death in September of 1976, the one that begins, "You have been wronged. Today we are separating into two worlds. May each keep his peace," and ends with her bones breaking, potentially. And it's a fascinating poem. So who do you think wrote it, Tiffany? Or what do our learners think?
So the majority of you seem to think that Jiang Qing wrote it, and many people do not believe that Mao wrote it.
So we would have to see the original in order to figure out whose calligraphy it is.
Right.
Presumably, assuming that Mao's calligraphy is still recognizable as his at this point in time.
Or if he even wrote it down, or if he just dictated it.
Could have dictated. But we have some great comments. And I say the more interesting things here are less what we have to say about this alleged poem, but what others have to say. So what does Inurjaya say?
At this point, he
or she, we don't know.
Right, believes that Mao, his mental health was no longer in good shape, so he probably didn't have the skills to write such a poem.
That's right. I mean, the Mao, she says, as described by German Chancellor Schmidt or Gerald Ford, is no longer in probably good enough shape to write something like this. But what is here's we have Kaoru 9282 says, I don't know, he could have written it. I know people do and say the strangest things when they are married. That's a great comment. He might have written it earlier, under influence. That's actually a really good point. Who knows when this was written? Because this is not the first political struggle these two have been in. It does not mean anything and obviously carried no weight, seeing how she ended up. Okay, who else?
Yes. Robert Herbert believes that the poem is quite confusing in itself, and
unlike the period.
Right.
Yes, right.
And so a lot of his last statements were likewise confusing, so perhaps he actually wrote it.
Right, yeah. I thought that was a very, so it has this kind of almost stream of consciousness, rambling. There's a certain rambling quality to it, and it is contradictory in terms of both wishing luck and predicting potential catastrophe at the same time. Who else has given us some? A lot of you have given great comments on this.
Bain USA Net, who states that it is not the question of authorship, but of authorial intent that is interesting here.
So this is Bain US Net is clearly a student of literature. Authorial intent is what matters.
That this was sort of a power grab, potentially.
Right. He says, whoever the author, it seems clear that they were looking to usurp or to legitimate leadership succession by a decree from Mao. So using this in one way or another.
And follows up with the question, did Mao's dictates still hold sway after death?
And in some sense, you could say that they did. If you have that famous piece of paper he is alleged to have given, not in poem form, to Hua Guofeng, Li Ban Shi Wo Feng Xin, with you in charge, I am at ease. This is this carries more weight than, quite frankly, anything else Hua Guofeng has done in his time, and Hua Guofeng uses it to be at least the initial successor to Mao Zedong. David Vincent writes in saying, I would say that she, that is Jiang Qing, wrote the poem. The couple had separated, so there is an easy perspective of the two parts. She sees the power struggles in the party, the political system, and she knows that it will be very dangerous after Mao's death. She wrote the poem as a play to save herself after Mao's death. Maybe if it had been a better poem, she would have been saved. And he goes on to say, I take the letter to be symptomatic of the collapse of the government and agree with Professor Kirby's interpretation, thank you, of the death of Mao being more like the end of a dynasty than the passing of power from one ruler to another. Jiang Qing, Reed Davis says, was not the first concubine to try to seize power on the death of her husband. She joins a list of unsuccessful court politicians, the Empress Wu Cixi, who was not unsuccessful, who paid the price for reaching too far. Who else do we have? Any other final comments here? Keth, yes.
Who makes a really good point about the use of a poem to legitimize one's position is very Chinese.
It is. It makes a really good point. Can you imagine any Western politician even writing a poem, let alone introducing one at a critical time in a political debate? And of course, the truth is, we can't, right? Political leadership's writings, however, particularly in the Maoist period compared to today, extraordinarily influential at this period of time. So if it were attributable to Mao, and if it really were by Mao, it would still have some influence. Well, listen, thank you all very, very much. We wish you a great end to this year, which is, as we are here in the last days right before Christmas of 2014, and a great start to 2015. And then on January 8th, we will welcome you into the world of contemporary China. Thanks very much. Happy holidays.